Hello, I'm Nate, aka B-Tier Mutineer, and in today's video I wanted to talk about my most anticipated RPG, Obsidian Entertainment's Avowed. I haven't had an RPG to properly look forward to in many years, so I'm really hoping that Avowed will become one of my favorite games to play. Most modern RPGs just haven't captured me the way older ones did, other than Disco Elysium, and I do sometimes get fatigued by replaying older games over and over. Some of you may be surprised to hear that Dragon Age the Veilguard isn't my most anticipated RPG, since I'm a huge fan of the Dragon Age series, but I will say that I am a huge fan of Dragon Age Origins specifically, not so much the other DA games. Unfortunately, the direction that BioWare took Dragon Age in doesn't interest me. I don't like the art style, the combat abilities, the level and mission design. I'll still play it, and probably make a few guides for it, but I don't expect it to be a game I'll enjoy replaying. In any case, we're not here to talk about Dragon Age, we're here to talk about Avowed, and why I think it has the potential to be one of the best RPGs, at least for my tastes. Avowed is an RPG set in the world of Eora, the setting of the Pillars of Eternity games. The Emperor of Ader sends the player character to the Living Lands as an envoy to get to the bottom of a soul plague called the Dream Scourge, find out what's causing it, and put a stop to it. However, there are also other characters, and I assume factions that these characters represent, that our character will come into contact with. In the story trailer, we hear the voice of the Emperor, whose perspective we already know. He wants to stop the Dream Scourge through whatever means necessary. Another important character is Inquisitor Lodwyn, who is a returning character from Pillars of Eternity Deadfire. She believes the Scourge is symptomatic of larger problems, a larger sense of chaos, disunity, destructiveness at the heart of the Living Lands. And finally, we hear from Giada, one of the possible companions, who believes chaos is a part of who we are, and it's what makes the Living Lands special. Her perspective is to embrace the chaos, cherish it, and tend to it instead. As is the case with all Obsidian RPGs, we will be able to make a decision on what we think is the right approach to deal with this plague and make things right in the Living Lands, thus having a hand in shaping the future of this region and its inhabitants. I love these kinds of RPGs in which you can approach quests differently, ally with certain factions, and have faction reputations that affect your experience interacting with NPCs in various regions. At least, that's what I'm hoping the game will be like, of course, but based on other RPGs made by Obsidian, I think that's likely what to expect in terms of the player's interactions with the inhabitants of the Living Lands. As a note, I only played a bit through both Pillars games because I couldn't really get into them due to getting overwhelmed by too many strange words and explanations that were not presented in a very organic way. Maybe it's my ADHD, but for some reason it just gave me a headache trying to absorb all the information. Turn-based combat with a lot of characters and abilities to keep track of is also a bit too much for me, so that's another reason why Pillars 1 and Deadfire didn't really hold my interest for too long. However, I really do appreciate what Obsidian has done with the setting, even with my limited knowledge. I've heard wonderful things about the lore, so I'm very excited to get to experience it in what seems to be a more me-friendly game. And yes, I do think that Avowed will feel more accessible to people who get overwhelmed and intimidated by too much info dumping. From the gameplay showcases, the conversations with NPCs look simpler. In part, I think this is because there are no narrator lines. We only get the dialogue itself, of course combined with the animations of the character speaking. There is still some kind of encyclopedia where we can read about certain terms and topics we don't understand, but I feel like I won't need to check this encyclopedia as much as I felt I needed to in the Pillars games. I've also heard some fans of the Pillars series, such as Mortesimo Gaming, say that they're excited about the lore this game will explore, as it seems we're going to get more information about godlikes due to our character being one. The Living Lands also seems to be a fascinating region to explore, and honestly, even as a more casual enjoyer, I'm very much intrigued by the plot and lore that were teased. I don't know much about the possible companions we're meeting in the game other than Yatsley, who I saw in a gameplay showcase and is voiced by Anjali Bhimani, one of my favorite voice actors. I personally prefer to keep myself as in the dark as possible regarding companions. I like being surprised by them and getting to experience them with a fresh perspective. If I see a bit too much information online from marketing materials and dev interviews, I end up having warped expectations of what the character will be like in game. I had this happen to me with Dragon Age Inquisition. I had this idea that Sarah was going to be a fun character I loved, but she ended up being, well, whatever that disaster was. So I'm afraid I can't say I have any opinion on the companions, since I don't really know who they are, what they're like, as well as what abilities they can offer. But what I will say is this: I trust the writers at Obsidian to create complex, compelling characters that are at the very least interesting, even if you don't personally like them. Speaking of companions though, the Pillars games have a fascinating relationship system between the player character and companions, as well as between the companions themselves. The system is based on the perspective each companion has upon various topics and philosophies that are relevant to the choices the player is going to be confronted with during the game. I'm hoping they'll use this system in Avowed, maybe an improved version, because I find it much more interesting than the BioWare special of Companion approves +5 or Companion greatly disapproves -20. In terms of gameplay, I love the switch to first and third person perspective rather than the party-based isometric style of Pillars. First and third person perspective games tend to be more immersive from a visual perspective since characters appear larger on the screen and it contributes to feeling closer to them. I do like isometric games, but I either want no combat like in Disco Elysium, simpler real-time combat, or action combat like Diablo. And in the case of the latter, I don't really care about the story in those types of games because the combat becomes the full focus. In terms of combat, I like what I've seen so far. It seems to be an easy-to-understand combat system. It has enough meaningful choices you can make to create a character build that fits your playstyle, while also being able to combine your abilities with each other and with companion abilities. The magic has that good fantasy feel to it without veering into silly or superhero territory, so I think it's well balanced from a visual standpoint at least. I've mentioned already that I love RPGs that actually give you multiple approaches to solve quests, but I also want to have multiple approaches on how to move through an area to get from point A to point B and deal with obstacles, enemies, NPCs, and things like that. Obsidian has always had this design pillar for their RPGs to offer the player multiple paths, and I have to say that for me it's a crucial element that makes me feel immersed in the role I choose to play with my character. The fact that I can approach situations differently based on my character's build and personality keeps me playing the game for longer and be more likely to actually finish a playthrough, which is a real problem due to my ADHD, as well as want to do multiple playthroughs of the game to get to experience what it's like to make different choices. In terms of exploration, they seem to be making more use of the verticality of the 3D space, which I always appreciate. Certainly, if you're going to make the switch from isometric to 3D, it's great to take advantage of all of the extra things you can get from 3D. The level design looks on point. Areas are of course designed in a more open way, which allows the player to approach an objective through a variety of paths. Something I'm not completely sure about is whether the areas we get to explore are fully open, or if there's going to be a loading screens between some areas, or have some parts possibly be blocked off until we reach a certain part of the story. I'm totally fine with having a few areas be locked for story reasons, as long as it makes sense within the game. I am, however, hoping for a pretty open world that we get to explore however and whenever we want, even if some areas may be very dangerous for a lower level character. I just like having the option to explore a place even if it's not the optimal path, just because it opens up more opportunities for role-playing. I can follow certain quest lines because I think my character would prioritize them, even if they take me to a part of the world I'm not very well equipped to deal with. And then I can try to come up with creative solutions to get through the challenge. This is my biggest question mark regarding the game because I do think that if the game limits the areas you can explore too much, it will feel bad, especially in contrast with the multiple choices you can make in quests. I've been trying to figure out why Avowed caught my attention so much, besides the obvious cool setting and Obsidian RPG parts, and the reason is, it reminds me of Morrowind. You're sent to an island that is full of wild weather, strange beasts, difficult to reach valleys full of oddities, and more importantly, you're there as a stranger, an interloper, an outlander, if you will, meddling in the affairs of the locals, and who will in the end have the power to shape the future of the region. I don't know necessarily if there will be a prophecy of some sort related to the Dream Scourge, though with the gods of Eora, as well as our character being a godlike, I think it's entirely possible to have some element of fate or prophecy tied into it as well. Even the Dream Scourge itself is making me think of the Blight and the Dreamers and in general Dagoth Ur's whole vibe in Morrowind. What I think Morrowind does really well is throw you into a world that feels strange and alien and then makes you feel like the alien through how people treat your character, how you have to learn about the island of Vardenfell and its people, culture, religion, geography, climate, beasts, etc. I get the feeling that this is somewhat the intended experience for the Living Lands in Avowed, especially considering some of the things we can hear about how our character is perceived by the locals in the gameplay trailer.
People don't like you very much, do they? Sent here to the Living Lands by an emperor who couldn't bother to come himself to investigate some plague that seems to be corrupting our very souls. You want us to trust you, but the truth is, you scare us.
I don't know whether you agree with my idea of Avowed having a similar feel to Morrowind, at least in terms of story and setting, but this is what I think has gotten me so interested in the game. There hasn't been a game quite like Morrowind, and if Obsidian manages to pull off the kind of atmosphere that keeps Morrowind so beloved even so many years later, I think they've got a huge hit on their hands. There is one thing about the game I'm not particularly pleased with, which is the title. Why Avowed? I didn't even know what this word meant until I researched it for this video. It apparently means someone or something that is openly declared or publicly acknowledged. I can't say I understand what that's meant to signify in relation to the game's story and setting, and I also don't think it's a title that catches your attention or sounds particularly appealing. I imagine that there are many other people who similarly to me don't know what Avowed is supposed to mean, and may be a bit confused on what to expect in relation to the game. While this seems like a minor gripe, video game titles are very important as they're one of the first things that a potential player sees in regards to the game, and a poorly chosen title can cause more players to be reticent to purchase it. Of course, Obsidian is a big name in the RPG scene, and Pillars of Eternity is an established IP, with fans who are likely to want to experience a new game in this setting, but I still find it a bit strange that the studio didn't lean more heavily into the game's setting or main story setup for its title. Just off the top of my head, the Dream Scourge sounds more evocative than Avowed, as does something more simple like The Living Lands. The thing is, I personally don't care about titles all that much. This game could be called crap on a stick, and I'd still give it a chance because I know it's made by Obsidian, a studio with a great track record in RPGs, but also because I've already seen trailers and gameplay of it that I enjoyed. So even though this isn't negative, it doesn't dampen my excitement for the game. It just worries me a little bit about how financially successful Avowed will end up being, since the title is such a big part of marketing. If I were to mention another negative just a little bit, it's that the animations for some things look a little bit stilted, both in combat and in conversations with NPCs. However, I don't want to make a big deal out of this right now, because I'm fairly certain the game is still in its alpha stage, and it's very likely that by the time of its release in February 2025, the animations and performance of the game in general should be a lot better than what we're currently seeing. Just wanted to mention this, since it is a little bit off-putting from the gameplay footage they've shown, but also letting you know not to worry too much about it, since the game still has some more testing and adjustments to go through until it gets to us. I'm speaking from my previous experience as a game tester. I can't think of any other negatives, because from what I've seen, the story, setting, and gameplay seem to be great. Only time will tell whether my opinion will remain the same, but of course I will make a review once Avowed comes out and I get the chance to play it myself, as well as very likely a few build guides. In any case, these have been my thoughts about Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming RPG, Avowed. Now, I'd like to hear from you. What do you think of the game so far, either as an existing Pillars fan or a player new to the IP? Do you plan on buying it day one, or are you waiting for some reviews first? And what do you think about my comparison between Avowed and Morrowind? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you're interested in more videos about Avowed as well as other RPGs, do remember to subscribe, and leave a like and comment while you're at it too. They really help. This has been B Tier Mutineer. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.